today is part 2 of Back to Bethel. Jacob and Esau, as you know, were brothers. They were twins. Jacob was called heel grasper because his twin brother Esau was born before he. And he came out literally of the womb grasping his brother's heel. So Jacob, hear me, Jacob, the very name means heel grasper, supplanter. Supplanter means someone who subverts, who deceives, who lies. And so you see him just scraping. Even as he is being born, he's coming out of the birth canal, scraping to try to get ahead of his brother. So his name is Jacob. We see that Esau, and I didn't say this last week, and I didn't use these words, but Esau despised his birthright. He despised his birthright because, as you know, as I described last week, he was a hunter. He was a man who would go out and with bow and arrow, and he would shoot game and bring back venison. His father Isaac loved venison, and he would make his father venison stew. He loved it so much, at the end of Isaac's life, he was almost completely blind. He couldn't see a hand in front of his nose, but he could hear and he could feel. He had his other senses. He told Esau, I want you to go out hunting, and I want you to bring back venison and make me the venison stew that I love so much. Now let me back up from there and tell you from last week. You remember it was Jacob who loved the birthright Esau had. He wanted that birthright. The birthright was in the Old Testament economy, even in the New Testament, the first male was given that birthright. And with that, not only came land and such as that, but blessings. So what they would actually do, at some point, they would bestow the birthright upon the firstborn son. And so that had not happened yet. And Jacob, wanting to receive that covenant blessing that Abraham had received, that was given to Isaac, and then Isaac was to give it to Esau, Jacob wanted it. So out goes Esau one day, and he's hunting. He's been away for a few days. He comes back, he's famished. He hasn't eaten probably in 2, maybe 3 days, and he's so hungry. His brother is fixing a stew, some kind of porridge, and it smelled so delicious that Esau said to Jacob, give me the stew. Jacob said to him, and I'm paraphrasing and ad-libbing here, boy, you think that the stew you've had in the past is good? This is the best stew you've ever tasted. So Esau said, as I gave the illustration last week, he said, a man's got to live. Jacob said, if you give me your birthright, I'll give you as much of this stew as you'd like. Now think about this. Who would give their birthright for a bowl of soup? Who in their right mind would be so cavalier with the blessing for generations to come that they would in some glib way say, what does it matter to me if I have a birthright if I die from starvation? He wasn't going to die from starvation. He was hungry. So what did he say? A man's got to live. When Satan tempts you, maybe it's a woman that's not your wife. You're tempted. Satan says to you, man's got to live. Man has urges. Man has desires. Man's got to live. Woman who is taken by the romantic gestures of another man at work, the attention that is given to her. He compliments the way she dresses as her husband never does. He talks about how wonderful she is at work and how she must be a wonderful wife and a wonderful mother. Compliments she never receives from her husband. She says, woman has to feel good about herself. What's wrong with a woman just hearing a man appreciate her? He just wants to have coffee. He just wants to meet me for coffee after work. What's wrong with that? So you understand, when we think about Esau, we think, how could he have been so inane? How could he have been so shallow that he would trade his birthright, his blessing, his children's honor and his children's blessing and his children's children for a mess of porridge? And he says to Jacob, man's got to live. I'll give you my birthright if you'll give me that stew. You think, man, who would throw away the blessing that comes with the birthright? Well, how many times have you thought about throwing it all away for 20 minutes of pleasure? A night secreted away with someone that no one knows about. To talk when everyone else is in bed on Facebook. Carrying on a relationship that's not appropriate. Talking in ways you should never talk to anyone except your spouse. You may not say, oh, I'm ready to give my birthright away, but you're ready to sell it all. You're ready to give it all away for that pleasure and that moment, just like Esau. And Esau said, here, you can have the birthright, but give me the stew. And he ate the stew, and he wiped his mouth and walked out the door. How foolish. Then when it came time for blessing, Isaac said to Esau, Esau, I want you to go out hunting, and I want you to bring back venison and make me some of that delicious venison soup that only you can make. Yes, Father, whatever will make you happy, whatever will make you delightful. They knew he was at the end of his days. So he took off into the forest, or he went into the wilderness, and that was the cue, not just for Jacob, but his mother. She said, now is the time to steal the birthright. He said to his mother, Mom, we don't have the same voice. In fact, Esau is a hairy man. I'm smooth-skinned. His mother said, I'll take care of that. Isn't it interesting how when we are prompted to do something like this, there's always a confederate or an ally ready to help us? And so what did she do? They took goat skin and they put the goat skin on his arms, and she made some goat stew, not venison stew, but goat stew, which he loved, but not as much as the other. It's a parallel metaphor in that as well. They bring it, set it before him. He begins to eat the soup. He's so taken because Jacob starts talking to him, and he says, whose voice is this? And Jacob says, this is Esau. And he said, come closer because the voice is Jacob, but the arms are Esau. And he said, would you bestow upon me my birthright? He began to give the blessings of the birthright. You will be blessed in all that you do. You'll be blessed in the field. You'll be blessed in the home. Your children will prosper. You will be the father of many nations, as the promise came from Abraham and to me. And now I bestow it upon you. All of Abraham's blessings are now given to you. And there's nothing that can take it back. This is a covenant that is sealed and cannot be rescinded. With that, it's over. Just that quickly, it's over. You lost the blessing. You traded it for a night of pleasure. You traded it for an evening with someone you hardly know. You've been carrying on, and you've kept this relationship, and now he wants to take it to the next level, and you are ready to sell it all, your birthright, your children's blessing, your future. You want to give it all away for that pleasure. So Jacob is told by his mother, you better prepare yourself. I've already gathered your clothes. Take off and don't come back. Go to Uncle Laban's and don't look back, because your brother, when he finds what has happened, will kill you. He took off and he came to a place called Luz. As he arrives there, Esau gets back home, and Esau comes in and he has the venison prepared and he brings it to his father, and his father said, what is this? It's the venison you wanted. He said, I've already eaten my soup. What else did you do? I gave the blessing, the firstborn blessing, the birthright to Esau. No, Father, I am Esau. Well, I've given your blessing to Jacob. He's livid, enraged. My father wants me to marry a girl from Canaan, from our inheritance in the promised land. But because of what he has done and because of what Jacob has done, I will go and get me a wife of the Ishmaelites. He goes out of spite and he marries an Ishmaelite. The burden of that sin and what he has done begins to fester over the years. The more he thinks about it, the more he wants to be the one to take the dagger and plunge it into the heart of his own brother. Meanwhile, Jacob arrives at a place called Luz. He puts not pillows, but stones down as pillows. He lay down and he begins to sleep. And as he sleeps, he has this dream that we know about. Angels on a ladder ascending and descending. He sees the glory of God as the angels ascend and descend upon his head. And he feels the presence and the blessings of God. And when he awakens the next morning, he said, this is the house of God, and I didn't even know it. How many times have you come to the house of God and God did something supernatural? Maybe it was in your own home, or maybe it was in the hospital, or maybe it was at the job, but you knew and saw the hand of God and there was no mistake. You said, this is the house of God, and I didn't know it. So he changed the name of the city from Luz to Bethel. House of God. Meanwhile, fast forward 14 years. He worked 7 years under the auspices of his father-in-law Laban. Laban promises him that he's going to give his daughter Rachel to him. He worked 7 years for Rachel's hand. And as I said last week, after they've had all of the pomp and ceremony, all of the glitz and all of the pageantry, it's time for them to consummate the marriage. Jacob goes into the tent. He's waiting on his beautiful bride. And who shows up? Leah. But I thought I was marrying Rachel. You want to talk about a wake-up call? You want to talk about somebody wake me up from this nightmare? But he's married. He goes to his father-in-law and he said, you deceived me. You lied to me. In fact, all of these 7 years, you've done nothing but manipulate, deceive, and lie to me. Does that sound familiar? In fact, when he has this dream of the angels ascending and descending, and he calls this place Bethel, God says to him then, you will no longer be Jacob, manipulator, supplanter, deceiver. You will be prince with God. See, when we are saved, God gives us these promises. God reveals to us at the moment we are saved and we are filled with His Spirit. He begins to reveal all of the riches, all of the spiritual glory He's going to bestow upon us and our children and our family. And we literally rejoice in the thought of that blessing. Even though we may not see the fulfillment of it, He waited 7 more years. Most of you don't know this. Some of you do, most of you don't. I waited 7 years for Beth. It was almost, well, of biblical proportions. I was telling somebody the other day about my grandmother whom I lived with. I had a grandmother, a very godly grandmother. And then my other grandma from Alabama, she was a Spitfire, but that's a different story. But my grandmother that I lived with, she told me one day, she said, "You like that Crabtree girl, don't you?" I said, "Well, yeah, I do." And while I was there, I actually had a fleece and I prayed very much like Jacob, but I prayed that God would show me, and God gave me a fleece. I won't get into that. It's a long story. You wouldn't understand it anyway. But it was undoubtedly, was when I prayed and I asked 3 days later that God would show me. I said, if this is your will, I need to know it. And I said, on a Friday night, I'm going to go to a mall at the other end of the city. I'm going to walk through it one time with my friend, and if I see Beth Crabtree, I'm going to know that's the girl I'm to marry, because I know there's something different. So my buddy comes by on Friday evening. I said I wasn't going to tell you this, and here I am telling it to you. In fact, the guy that fixed us up to begin with, he said, Todd Weston, he said, "What do you want to do?" I said, "I want to go to the Battlefield Mall." He said, "What for?" I said, "Let's just go, Todd. I'll explain later," which I never did until we got married. We drive there, and we go to the back of the mall. And we enter into the arcade area, which I never played arcade games or anything, but we entered from the arcade section, and when we walked in, we took about 3 steps, and my friend Todd said, "Look, Mark, there's Beth Crabtree." True story. With another guy. So, I waited 7 years. Now, don't think for a moment, when I was standing at the front of the altar, I didn't look over my shoulder a couple of times just to make sure the right Crabtree girl walked down the aisle. No, I'm teasing. Or McClure girl. I mean, they could. Anyway, 7 years. So he waited for Rachel 7 years, and then he marries. Leah and Rachel are both his wives. So as they leave, and here's where we pick up the narrative. They fled from Laban. He's going back to the place of promise. You see, you can be in Egypt or in the wilderness for a time. It's a time when your soul is tested. It's a time where God proves you. It's a time where God develops you. It may not be that place that He's promised you yet, but He's developing you even in that wilderness experience. Even though you may not, have ascended into that place of promise or blessing that He's given to you, you need to wait upon God because it will come. The Bible says, though it tarry, wait for it, it will appear. And so as he's going back now, he has fled from Laban, a day or two's flight from his father-in-law, and his father-in-law catches up with them. They put their tents down as they go and travel, and he comes to them and he says, "You have stolen an idol from me, and I want it back." And he said, Jacob said, I've stolen no idol. I have nothing of yours that I have not been given or you haven't promised to me. And he said, well, let me search. He goes and searches to everyone, the servants, bond and free, the wives, those that are part of his retinue. He goes to each one of them. The last one being Rachel, she's in the tent, and he goes in to accost Rachel, and Rachel is seated, and he says to her, get up. And she says, would you make your own daughter stand and humiliate herself during her cycle? And he says, well, where's the idol? Jacob says, I don't know. Laban leaves, only to find that his wife Rachel has held on to an idol. Now look as they go back, and I'm only going to read a couple of verses and close. Verse 2, then Jacob said unto his household and to all that were with him, put away the strange, not idol, put away the strange gods that are among you, and be clean and change your garments. And let us arise and go up to Bethel, and I will make there an altar unto God, who answered me in the day of my distress and was with me in the way which I went. Jacob said this, get rid of your gods. See, you can only start with one idol. That's all you need. One idol in your home, and it will metastasize into idols. It will metastasize into false gods. It only takes one. And some of you today, let me tell you something. You are the priest of your home. Whether you're a single father, single mother, or you're a father and mother, you, father, are the priest of your home. You are the spiritual leader. You are the one to ask the questions. And you don't just let your kid give you some shallow answer about where they're going Friday night. You follow up on who they're going to be with and what they're going to do. Amen. Don't you let them tell you, this is my phone. You don't have a right to know what is said. You don't have a right to know my passcode. If you pay for it, you have a right to know. Or this is my room. It's off limits to you. If I would have told my father that, my father would have pitched me out on my head. Now listen. It is time, folks, that we quit blaming Hollywood and the school system and everybody else and start looking in our own lives and our own families and say, I'm going to clean up my house. We're going to build an altar unto God and consecrate our family, consecrate our children. Does that mean they'll ever be tempted or never be tempted? No, but it means you have set God as the priority of your life. And listen to me. As my father told me, if you think that you're old enough to make your own choices in this house, then you go out and find another one and you can make the rules yourself. God has given you not only the right, but the responsibility. Dad, you are the one to call your family to the altar. You are the one to say, as far as me and my house, we're going to serve God. There's Jacob. There's Philip. Imagine Philip with 4 virgin daughters who prophesied. How would you like to have gone to his house for lunch? 4 virgin daughters who prophesied. You go into his house and one of the daughters says, Dad, I need to talk to you about this man. Do you know what he's been doing? He didn't tell you, but he's been out. I would not have wanted to go to that house unless I knew I was living the straight and narrow. Now listen, we need to understand God is doing a shaking in America. God is shaking. I want to tell you right now, some of you are not going to like the shaking. Some of you may say, you know, this church has gone too far. We need to learn to fit in with the culture in America. We need to quit being embittered or quit battling what is happening in America and reflect the culture more in the church. That's what's being taught today. But I want to tell you something, folks. God has called us to purity and sanctification. He told us to come out from among them and be ye holy. And if we are to be God's people, we must be a holy people.
Amen. Amen.
I want to close with this. On Wednesday night, I told the men in the first service, at the end of the service, and maybe the mom and son is here, and I don't want to embarrass them, but I do want to tell the story because Joel says in the last days, I'm going to raise up a generation. We think you've got to be over 30 years of age before you speak in tongues in the service, or that you prophesy, or that you discern spirits, or that you lay hands upon the sick. Well, on Wednesday night after the service, as I was making my way to the back, one of the dear ladies in our church, and she may be here right now, she came up and she stood and waited for at least 20 minutes, I know, because I talked to several people. And when I finally got through and Pastor George was standing there, he can vouch for this, what I'm saying. She's standing there with her 8-year-old son. She said, on Sunday, Pastor, you said something about you have your own family, but that you have spiritual children as well. And that you want to be a spiritual father to children and to people in the church. And I said, that's right. And she said, well, this is my son. Gave me his name, and she said, he's 8 years old. He wants to ask you a question. I thought he was going to say, who killed the giant, or who climbed the sycamore tree, or something along that line. And he said to me, and he stopped and he looked up at his mother and he spoke to her in Portuguese, and he looked at me and he said, I want to ask you this question, and spoke to her again in Portuguese. Then he said, can I pray for you? And I said, sure. He said, well, you want to sit down? So I sat down in one of the pews back here, a few chairs back. And he said, I want to anoint you with oil. Where's the oil? So Brother George runs and gets the oil, and he comes back. He says, hold your hands open. George did, and he poured the oil. Kid does like this. He put his hands on my head. And what happened next? George can testify to this. This 8-year-old boy started to pray and prophesy over me. Hallelujah. Like a 35 or 40-year-old man. Hallelujah. It was not infantile. He didn't trip over his words. He said, the Lord has anointed you. The Spirit of God is upon you from the top of your head to the soles of your feet. I have called you out to be a prophet. I'm going to anoint you. I'm going to bless you. You're going to touch souls. You're going to touch lives. And what you've asked of me, I'm going to do. I literally thought I was going to fall on the floor. He prophesied over me like someone who was 40 or 50 years of age. Hallelujah. Yes, Lord. And when he got through, he became an 8-year-old boy again. When the Spirit of God comes upon you, He transformed you. And some of you right now, you have gifts that God has given you, spiritual gifts that lie dormant in your life because of fear, or because you haven't used them, or you don't think it's appropriate, but God has given you those gifts to use them. And today, God is going to fill you with His Holy Spirit. I want everyone to stand to their feet.